The dread began, as it always does, in the quiet moments before the performance. For Elias, a cartographer of forgotten cities, it was the low hum of anxiety before a dinner party. A gathering of esteemed colleagues, their laughter like the clinking of fine cutlery, their judgments as sharp and precise as the tools of his trade. He stood before the cracked mirror in his hallway, a relic from a previous tenant he'd never bothered to replace. It showed him back in pieces, a nervous eye here, a trembling lip there, a fractured man, ill-equipped for a world that demanded seamless, polished surfaces. He wasn't enough. He never was. This feeling, this cold, familiar certainty of his own inadequacy was the anchor that held him fast in a sea of loneliness. He straightened his tie, a futile gesture. The man in the mirror was a stranger cobbled from mismatched parts. But tonight he had a secret. In a small lacquered box, lined with crimson velvet, lay his salvation. It was a mask, not of leather or wood, but of pristine, bone-white porcelain, shaped into a face of serene, confident charm. It had the kind of effortless smile that opened doors and calmed suspicious hearts. It wasn't a caricature. It was an ideal. A perfect, unblemished man. He'd found it in a dusty antique shop, tucked away, as if waiting just for him. He lifted it, the porcelain cool against his fingertips. As he raised it to his face, the world held its breath. The moment it settled against his skin, a strange warmth spread through him. The splintered reflection in the cracked mirror suddenly coalesced. The man looking back was no longer Elias, the hesitant cartographer. He was whole. He was magnificent. He entered the party not as himself, but as the mask. And the world, which had always been a fortress, lowered its drawbridge. His jokes landed with effortless grace. His opinions were met with nods of profound agreement. The most influential professor, a man whose gaze usually passed right through Elias, now hung on his every word, clapping him on the back. A woman with eyes the color of twilight, who had never noticed him before, laughed at a story he didn't remember inventing, her hand lingering on his arm. The mask knew what to say, how to stand, when to smile. It navigated the treacherous currents of social ritual with the instinct of a master sailor. Elias was merely a passenger inside, watching through two small, dark holes as this perfect stranger piloted his body to victory. He felt a dizzying rush of acceptance, a warmth he had craved his entire life. The mask was not a deception, it was a revelation. It was the key. He began to wear it everywhere, to the university, where his once ignored lectures now received standing ovations, to the market, where vendors saved him their finest produce. The mask earned him a promotion, then another. It won him the affection of the woman with twilight eyes. His life, once a collection of hesitant sketches, was now a vibrant, finished masterpiece. And you? Don't you have a box like that? A face you put on for the world, a carefully curated self that gets you through the day? He told himself it was just a tool, a uniform for success. But the crimson velvet box on his nightstand began to gather dust. The intervals between wearing the mask grew shorter, then disappeared entirely. He started sleeping in it, the cold porcelain, a constant, reassuring pressure against his cheek. One morning, he woke and out of a flicker of old habit, went to remove it. His fingers found no edge, no seam. The porcelain had fused with his skin. A thread of panic stitched its way up his spine, but it was a distant feeling, muffled, as if happening to someone else. He rushed to the cracked mirror, the only witness to his original sin. The man in the glass was the same serene, confident stranger, but through the fractures, Elias could see something was wrong. The smile, once his greatest asset, now looked painted on, lifeless. The eyes, seen through the slits, held a flicker of primordial terror. He spent hours trying to find a purchase, a way to pry the mask loose, his real fingernails scratching uselessly against the smooth, unyielding surface, but there was nothing to grip. The mask and the man had become one. Years bled into one another. His success was absolute. He had the career, the wife, the admiration of all. Yet, he was a prisoner inside his own head, a ghost haunting the beautiful facade he had constructed. The world loved the mask, but the man underneath was suffocating. He could no longer remember the sound of his own laugh, only the mask's perfectly modulated chuckle. He couldn't remember how to cry. The porcelain was incapable of shedding tears. One afternoon, sitting on a park bench, a small child, no older than 5, toddled up to him. She looked past the serene smile, past the confident brow, and stared directly into the dark holes of his eyes. "Mister," she asked, her voice clear as a bell, "why are you so sad?" The question struck him with the force of a physical blow. Someone had finally seen him. Someone had seen the screaming man behind the perfect smile. He fled home in a blind panic. He smashed his fists against his face, the sound a dull, sickening thud. Nothing. He grabbed a heavy bronze candlestick and brought it crashing down onto the cracked mirror, shattering the last fragmented image of himself. In a frenzy, he clawed at his cheek with the jagged base of the candlestick. The porcelain finally gave way. A spiderweb of cracks appeared, and with a sound like tearing silk, a piece flaked off. He felt a surge of triumphant hope. He was getting free. He scrambled to the broken shards of the mirror on the floor, desperate to see what lay beneath. He held a piece up to his wounded face. He saw the cracked porcelain. He saw the dark, terrified eye peering through, and underneath the broken piece, he saw nothing. Not scarred skin, not blood, not bone, just a hollow, black emptiness. A void. There was no man left under the mask. There was only the mask. The original face, neglected and starved for years, had simply withered away into nothing. He had traded his soul for a smile, and it had been a final, binding sale. The ancients called it a curse, this hollowing out of the self. Today, psychology names it the devouring persona. It's the seductive trap of social assimilation, the danger of mistaking the armor you wear for the skin it's meant to protect. It's the gnawing emptiness that follows, a life spent performing for an audience, only to realize the theater is empty and you've forgotten your own lines. He sat there, among the glittering ruins of his mirror, a man with a hole in his face, touching the cold edge of the void. Be careful what you pretend to be. You might just become it. You glance at the time, a familiar spike of anxiety. You're late. You're behind. You're running out of it. We are all servants to the clock's steady tick. But what if the clock itself is a liar, and its ticking is the sound of your own cage being built? Alara measured her life in coffee spoons and commuter train schedules. Each day was a perfect replica of the one before, a masterpiece of monotony, painted in shades of gray. From the 7 o'clock a.m. alarm to the 5 o'clock p.m. sigh of release, she worked as a data archivist, filing away the histories of lives that felt more real than her own. A quiet, gnawing dread was her constant companion, the feeling of being fundamentally stuck. She would stare out the window at the distant hills, and dream of walking away, of a life unwritten by timetables. But a profound inertia held her in place. The thought of change was a terrifying void, and the familiar rhythm of her suffering, at least, was a rhythm she knew. It was better, she told herself, than no rhythm at all. This feeling was an echo of the city she lived in, a metropolis of towering spires and immaculate streets built on the principle of perfect, thoughtless order. Atop every building, from the grandest municipal hall to the humblest bakery, was a magnificent clock face made of marble and gold. But every single clock had no hands. Time was not told, it was given. The city was governed by a series of chimes broadcast from a central, unseen tower, orchestrated by a figure known only as the chime keeper. A soft, melodic chime to wake, a sharp, insistent one to begin work, a low, resonant one to eat, a final, mournful chime for sleep. The citizens moved in placid synchronicity, their lives a seamless ballet of dictated actions. They praised the system, for it had freed them from the terrible burden of choice, from the anxiety of the unknown. Alara, like all the others, lived in an apartment that was, in truth, a gilded birdcage, suspended by a single, thick cable from the underside of a vast sky bridge. Hundreds of thousands of these cages hung in perfect rows over a great dark expanse known as the Whispering Sea. The official story was that the sea was a chaotic, bottomless abyss that would swallow anyone foolish enough to fall. The cages were for their safety, the chimes were for their peace, and so they lived, suspended in their beautiful prisons, praising the benevolence of the chime keeper and telling themselves the gentle sway of their cages was the feeling of being rocked to sleep, not the slow, steady motion of a pendulum marking a life unlived. Then came the great silence. It began without warning. One morning, the wake-up chime never sounded. A nervous quiet fell over the city of hanging cages. The work chime, too, was absent. Panic, a feeling long sedated by routine, began to stir. People stared out of their cages at one another, their faces blank with confusion. Without the chimes, they were paralyzed. When should they eat? When should they work? They were puppets whose strings had been cut. Days bled into one another in a haze of anxious waiting. But in the suffocating silence, Alara began to hear something new, a sound from below. Not the terrifying roar the legends described, but a soft, rhythmic lapping, a sound like a slow, steady heartbeat. Drawn by a curiosity that felt like a betrayal, she peered through the bars of her cage floor for the first time. Below her was not a chaotic abyss, but a vast, tranquil ocean, shimmering under a hidden moon, and she saw it then, the great lie, laid bare in the moonlight. The fear of the sea was a story told to keep them from looking down. The chimes were not a guide, they were a distraction. The clocks with no hands were a monument to their stolen will. How long had she been listening to the chimes, telling herself the cage was safe? A frantic search began. Tucked away beneath her sleeping perch, caked in rust and disuse, was a small, simple latch. It had always been there. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The fear was immense, a physical sickness, but the sight of the serene water below gave her a strength she didn't know she possessed. With a scream that was half terror, half triumph, she forced the latch open. A section of the floor swung down. She did not fall. Instead, a simple rope ladder, coiled and waiting, dropped into the quiet air. Below it, tethered to the ladder's end, a small, sturdy boat bobbed gently on the surface of the water. Freedom had never been a distant dream. It had been waiting, patiently, just beneath her feet. In myth, it was a punishment from the gods to be trapped in an eternal, pointless task. In you, it's the habit you can't see, learned helplessness. It is the invisible cage built from the ghosts of past failures, the quiet surrender to a miserable certainty because the risk of an unknown freedom feels too great to bear. It is the voice that whispers, "Don't even try. It won't make a difference." She looked back at the silent city of cages, at the thousands of souls still frozen, waiting for a bell that would never ring again. She took a breath, and she began to climb down. Sometimes the walls of the prison are not made of iron, but of the belief that there is no key. We tell ourselves we want freedom, that we crave control over the grand narrative of our lives, yet show us the throne of our own sovereignty, and we will run from it in terror, begging for a king, a map, a fate, anything to avoid the crushing weight of the crown. Julian was a ghost in his own life. He drifted through his days on a current of indecision. A young man so terrified of making the wrong choice that he made no choices at all. Career paths appeared before him like forks in a road, and he would simply stand at the crossroads until the opportunities withered and vanished. Potential lovers would offer their hands, but he would not take them, paralyzed by the infinite possibilities of where that might lead. He yearned for a lightning strike of purpose, a booming voice from the heavens to point the way and say, this is who you are. This is what you must do." The burden of an unwritten page was too much to bear. He didn't want to be the author of his own story. He just wanted to be a character with clear, simple stage directions. His quiet desperation was a prayer, and one day the world answered. He found himself no longer in his small, cluttered apartment, but standing at the edge of a valley, choked with a thick, silent fog. The air was cold and still. In the very center of the valley, rising from the mist, was an immense throne, carved from a single piece of black obsidian. It seemed to drink the light from the air, yet it pulsed with a deep, internal glow. It was a seat of terrifying power, of absolute authority. Carved into its base were ancient words that resonated in his soul. Who reigns here, reigns his world. This was it, the throne of his own will, the seat of his agency. To sit upon it would be to declare himself the sole and ultimate ruler of his own life, responsible for every victory, every failure, every meaningless moment. From the base of the throne, a single narrow path extended, a rickety rope bridge that stretched out over a fathomless chasm before disappearing into the dense fog. This was the path of a self-determined life. No map, no guarantees, just the terrifying, exhilarating act of putting one foot in front of the other into the great unknown. He felt a magnetic pull toward the throne, a flicker of the king he could be, but it was immediately extinguished by a wave of pure dread. The sheer scale of that responsibility was a weight that would crush him. He was not a king. He was an imposter. He noticed other figures moving like specters in the fog. Men and women, young and old, all circling the throne at a safe distance, their faces etched with the same mixture of longing and terror he felt. They were all waiting for permission, for a sign, for a ruler to appear and release them from the agony of their own freedom. Just as Julian was about to turn and dissolve back into the comfortable numbness of the mist, a figure emerged, tall and imposing, clad in regal robes and wearing a polished, golden mask that reflected Julian's own terrified face back at him. The figure's voice was like honey and steel, a sound of perfect, unshakable certainty. "You're lost, little one," the figure said, its voice echoing in the valley. "You seek a purpose, I can give you one. Your destiny is not to rule, but to serve a cause greater than yourself. It is a noble path, a safe path. Here is your map. The figure produced an ornate scroll, its pathways illuminated with golden ink. Your life will have meaning. You will never be lost again. All I ask in return is a simple oath. Kneel before the throne, or swear that you will never seek to sit upon it yourself. A wave of relief so profound, it brought tears to Julian's eyes washed over him. It was the absolution he had been praying for, to be freed from himself. Without a moment's hesitation, he fell to his knees before the obsidian throne, the cold ground a welcome comfort. I swear, he whispered, his voice trembling with gratitude. The robed figure nodded slowly. Then it raised its hands and removed the golden mask. Julian gasped. The face beneath was his own, but it was a version of himself he had only seen in his darkest moments, weak, gaunt, etched with the deep lines of pure, undiluted fear. It was his own cowardice, made flesh. By refusing the throne, he had crowned his own terror as his king. The horrifying doppelganger, his fear personified, now climbed onto the empty throne. The moment it sat down, the deep, inner light of the obsidian died, becoming a dull, lifeless black. A loud crack echoed through the valley as the rope bridge, the only path forward, snapped and plunged into the chasm below. Julian was now a loyal subject in a kingdom of one, forever trapped in the fog, ruled by the tyrant he had willingly created. Sages warned of false idols, but psychology warns of the one you build from your own anxieties. It calls it abdicated agency, the desperate escape from freedom. It is the act of handing the scepter of your life to your fears, your habits, your excuses, anything to avoid the lonely, terrifying, and glorious burden of ruling yourself. Julian remained on his knees, a willing prisoner, looking up at the pathetic, frightened king he had chosen to obey. Your greatest enemy will never be the world. It will be the king you were too afraid to become. Look up, high above the noise and confusion of your life. Can you see it? A glimmering promise, a destination that you believe holds the key to your happiness. Now look at your hands. Are they building a life or just a ladder to an illusion? Anya was an architect of shadows. She lived her life in a perpetual state of before. Her real life, she was convinced, had not yet begun. It was waiting for her on the other side of a single monumental achievement, the creations of a masterpiece, a painting that would finally quiet the relentless critic in her head and earn her the belonging she so desperately craved. Her present moments were not for living. They were currency to be spent in service of this future salvation. Friends invited her out, but she would decline, seeing their laughter as a theft of precious time. The sun would set in a blaze of color outside her studio window, a masterpiece in its own right, but she would not notice. Her eyes fixed on the canvas. Her entire existence had become a waiting room for a feeling of arrival. She lived in a city and a world that encouraged this obsession. From birth, every person could see their own personal door floating high in the sky. Each door was unique, crafted from the wood of their deepest desires, its keyhole whispering a promise only they could hear. One person's door promised perfect love, another's absolute power, a third's eternal peace. Anya's door, a simple, elegant arch of silver birch, hummed with the single, seductive word, enough. The entire world was a forest of scaffolding and half-finished towers, a testament to the planet-wide obsession with reaching these celestial portals. Life was not a journey, it was a climb. On her desk, amidst the clutter of brushes and dried pigments, Anya kept a single, luminous moth trapped in a glass jar. At night, when the loneliness became a physical ache, she would light a candle and place it just outside the glass. The moth, a creature of pure, suicidal instinct, would throw itself at the transparent wall, its beautiful iridescent wings slowly turning to a fine gray dust. It would batter itself into exhaustion, hypnotized by a warmth it could feel but never touch, a light it could see but never reach. Anya would watch it, a feeling of sad, detached pity in her heart for the simple, tragic creature. She sacrificed everything for her tower. Decades fell away like sawdust. Her hands became gnarled, her face a roadmap of her singular focus. Her relationships turned to ghosts, then to faint memories. But the tower grew. It rose above the others, a testament to her unwavering devotion. Finally, old and breathless, her body frail, but her will unbreakable, she placed the last stone. She had arrived. The climb was over. She made the slow, final ascent, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. This was it, the moment her real life would begin. She stood on the final platform, high above the clouds, the world a distant blur below. The silver birch door floated just before her, humming with its irresistible promise. Her hand, wrinkled and stained with a lifetime of paint, trembled as she reached out and pushed. The door swung inward without a sound. She braced herself for a cascade of golden light, for the flood of peace, for the feeling of finally being enough. But there was nothing, just the cold, thin air of the upper atmosphere, just more empty blue sky. The door was a frame, a beautiful, ornate, and utterly empty frame around a void. It was a projection of her own longing, a mirage in the desert of her own dissatisfaction. The promise was never in the door. It was an echo in the empty rooms of her own heart. A devastating, silent clarity washed over her. She looked down and for the first time truly saw the world. She saw the millions of other towers, the millions of other souls, all frantically climbing, sacrificing their one and only life for a beautiful lie. She saw the sunset she had ignored 1,000 times. She heard the faint sound of laughter from a world she had refused to live in. She thought of the moth in the jar, and the pity she'd felt was replaced by a sudden, soul-crushing empathy. She, too, had spent her life beating her wings to dust against an invisible wall, mesmerized by a light she could never possess. The old myths call it the curse of Tantalus, forever reaching for a fruit that pulls away. Modern psychology gives it a quieter, more intimate name, the arrival fallacy. It is the pervasive, seductive lie that happiness is a place you get to, a prize you can win, a door you can open. It is the engine of a life spent in constant pursuit, which ensures you are never truly present for the life you already have. Anya stood at the top of her magnificent, useless tower, a queen of an empty kingdom, with only the wind to hear her weep. Stop building ladders to a door in the sky. The kingdom of heaven is on the ground, and you have been walking through it all along. Think of the person you despise the most. Feel the certainty of your judgment, the clean, satisfying righteousness of your condemnation. Now, what if I told you that every monster you see in the world is just a reflection in a mirror you refuse to look at, a lost part of yourself howling to be seen? Kyle was a man of impeccable moral clarity. He lived in a house of stark white walls and polished floors, a reflection of the pristine architecture of his own soul, or so he believed. He was a pillar of his community, known for his rationality, his charity, and his unerring ability to identify the faults in others. He saw the world as a garden, and it was his solemn duty to point out the weeds, the greed of his neighbor, the simmering anger of his colleague, the laziness of the local shopkeeper. Each judgment was a small, satisfying snip of the shears, reinforcing the clean lines of his own virtue. He felt no hatred for these people, only a kind of weary pity. He was good, they were not. The distinction was as clear to him as black and white. But Kael had a secret life, a vocation known only to him. He was a shadow collector. In the dead of night, he would venture out with his only tool, a strange, ornate lantern that, when lit, did not cast light, but rather a cone of profound, tangible darkness. When this darkness fell upon a person, their shadow would leap from their feet, trapped and terrified in the unnatural gloom. Kael would then capture the writhing shadow in a specially prepared glass jar, sealing it tight with a silver lid. His house had a locked room, a library not of books, but of these jars. Thousands of them lined the shelves from floor to ceiling, each containing a swirling, smoky mass of captured shadow, and each jar bore a neat, handwritten label: envy, captured from a woman who glanced at a friend's new dress; rage, from a man who swore in traffic; deceit, from a child who had lied about eating a cookie. He saw himself as a purifier, a janitor of the human soul, locking away the darkness so the light could flourish. He took great pride in one particular detail: he himself cast no shadow. In his mind, this was the ultimate proof of his purity, but he never noticed that with every shadow he collected, his own body became a little more translucent, a little more faint, as if he were slowly being erased. One evening, he captured the shadow of a truly cruel man, a shadow so dark and twisted it fought against his lantern's power. After a great struggle, he managed to seal it in a jar. As he wrote the label, "Cruelty," he noticed that his hand was nearly transparent. He could see the grain of the wooden table right through his own skin. A cold terror, an emotion he had long since locked away, seized him. He looked up, his own reflection staring back at him from the curved glass of the very jar he was holding. But it was not his face he saw. It was the face of the cruel man, contorted in fear and pain. Stumbling backward, he knocked another jar from the shelf. Lust. It shattered on the floor. He looked at the shards, and in every piece, he saw the face of the young woman from whom he had stolen it. He spun around, his eyes wide with horror, and looked at the thousands of jars. They were not mirrors. They were windows, and trapped inside, every single one was a terrified, weeping, raging piece of himself. He had never been collecting the shadows of others. He had been dismembering his own soul. Every time he had judged another, he had seen a part of himself he could not bear to accept. So he had performed a psychic amputation, cutting that piece of his own shadow away, projecting it onto the other person, and then imprisoning it. The jars did not contain their sins. They contained all the parts of himself he had denied: his own rage, his own envy, his own cruelty, his own desire. He was not a collector. He was a collection of his own rejected fragments. He had made himself pure by becoming hollow. In a final, desperate act of courage, the first truly courageous act of his life, he reached for a jar labeled fear and twisted the lid. The smoky shadow billowed out, not to attack him, but to rush into him, a river returning to its sea. The pain was excruciating, a lifetime of denied terror felt in a single instant, but his hand turned solid. He felt a surge of warmth, of substance. He opened another. Shame. Then anger. Each one was an agony, an integration of a demon he had sworn was not his, but with each one, he became more real, more solid, more whole. Ancient wisdom speaks of demons that must be named to be tamed. Psychology calls this vast, disowned territory by a single name, the shadow. It is the home of everything we refuse to be, everything that infuriates, disgusts, and offends us in other people is a secret map pointing to a lost part of our own soul. Wholeness is not achieved by cutting away the darkness. It is achieved by embracing it. Kale stood, for the first time, complete. The room was empty, the jars gone, and behind him, cast by the single bare bulb of the room, lay his own dark, definite, and beautiful shadow, finally returned home. Stop hunting the monsters in the world. Turn around and have the courage to face the ones you've locked inside. They are not your enemies. They are your power.